On March 14, 2025, at 2:17 in the afternoon, Ethan Cole was 3,280 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean when his sonar screen lit up with something that shouldn't exist. The coordinates were 34 degrees north, 121 degrees west, approximately 180 miles off the California coast, in waters so deep that sunlight hadn't reached the seafloor in millions of years. Ethan, 36 years old, former Navy dive specialist turned commercial submersible pilot with 14 years of deep water operations under his belt, had logged over 400 dives in his career. He was a father of 7-year-old twins, volunteered as a diving instructor for veterans dealing with PTSD, and held 3 separate certifications for piloting deep submergence vehicles. This was supposed to be a routine mapping mission, the kind of contract he'd done 100 times before. But at 2:17 p.m., his sonar detected a biological signature moving at 40 knots at depth, and the water temperature inside the thermal scanner spiked from 39 degrees Fahrenheit to 68 degrees in less than 12 seconds. The submersible he was piloting, the DSV-7 Challenger Deep 2, was rated for depths up to 4,000 feet and equipped with 4 external cameras, forward-facing sonar array, and a titanium pressure hull strong enough to withstand 600 atmospheres. The vessel belonged to the Pacific Oceanic Research Institute, a privately funded marine science organization based out of San Diego that contracted Ethan for deep-water thermal vent surveys. The mission was straightforward: descend to 3,000 feet, map hydrothermal activity along a newly discovered ridge system, collect water samples, document any unusual geological formations. Ethan had started his descent at 11:32 that morning, accompanied topside by the research vessel Nautilus and a team of 6 oceanographers led by Dr. Sienna Zhao. His co-pilot for the dive, Reed Mitchum, monitored all systems from the support vessel and maintained constant radio communication. The descent had taken 2 hours and 45 minutes, following strict decompression protocols. Everything was by the book. Everything was normal. Until it wasn't. The sonar reading showed an object between 58 and 62 feet in length, moving laterally across his bow at a speed that violated everything Ethan knew about deep-sea locomotion. At that depth, at that pressure, nothing biological moved faster than 15, maybe 20 knots maximum. 40 knots was physically impossible. The energy required, the drag coefficient, the sheer muscular force needed to push that much mass through water under that much pressure, it didn't add up. Ethan's first thought was equipment malfunction. He ran a systems diagnostic. All green. He checked the sonar calibration. Perfect. Then he saw it through the forward viewport. The external floodlights, each pumping 12,000 lumens into the darkness, caught the shape as it passed 70 feet ahead of the submersible. Triangular dorsal fin, easily 8 feet tall. Streamlined body, unmistakable hydrodynamic profile, crescent tail fin cutting through the water with movements that seemed almost leisurely despite the impossible speed. And then Ethan saw what it was chasing. A juvenile gray whale, approximately 35 feet long, was fleeing in erratic spirals, leaving a trail of disturbed sediment and what looked like blood in the water. The whale was moving fast, driven by pure panic, but the predator was faster. Ethan activated all 4 camera systems, recording from every angle. His hands moved on autopilot, adjusting floodlight angles, stabilizing the submersible's position, keeping the creature in frame. The predator made a lateral turn that should have been physically impossible at that speed, its entire body rotating 90 degrees in less than 2 seconds without losing momentum. That's when Ethan saw the teeth, rows of serrated triangular teeth, each one easily 6 inches long, visible even at this distance because they reflected the floodlights with an almost metallic sheen. The creature closed the distance to the whale in 3 powerful strokes of its tail. And Ethan Cole, father of twins, veteran Navy diver, man who'd seen giant squid and deep-sea sharks and things most people only saw in documentaries, realized he was watching something the world had declared extinct 3.5 million years ago. The attack lasted 43 seconds. Ethan watched through the viewport as the creature struck the whale from below, massive jaws clamping onto the smaller animal's midsection with enough force that the impact created a visible shock wave in the water. The whale convulsed once, twice, and then went still. The predator didn't release immediately. Instead, it held position, jaws locked, as if waiting to confirm the kill. Then it began to feed. Ethan forced himself to keep recording, to keep the cameras steady, even as his brain screamed that what he was witnessing violated every principle of modern paleontology. The creature's movements were efficient, almost surgical. It wasn't the frenzied feeding of a shark in blood frenzy. This was calculated, controlled, the behavior of an apex predator that had nothing to fear and no reason to rush. When it finally released the whale's carcass and began to swim away, Ethan got his clearest view yet. The body was easily 60 feet long, possibly more. The coloration was darker than he expected, almost charcoal gray with lighter patches along the ventral side. And the teeth, those impossible teeth, were not white like modern shark teeth. They had a yellowish, almost amber quality that suggested age, but also something else. Something that made Ethan's hands shake as he adjusted the camera zoom. Those teeth showed wear patterns, fresh wear patterns, the kind of microfractures and edge damage that came from recent use, from active predation, not from millions of years of fossilization. "Nautilus, this is Challenger Deep 2, Ethan said into his comm system, his voice steadier than he felt. "I need you to confirm you're receiving my video feed. All 4 camera angles. I need confirmation that this is recording on your end, not just mine." Reed's voice came back immediately, tight with something that might have been excitement or fear or both. "Confirmed, Ethan. We're seeing it. Dr. Zhao is watching the feed right now. She says to hold position and keep recording as long as you have visual." Ethan wanted to laugh at that. Hold position. As if he could do anything else. As if he could look away from what he was seeing. The creature had moved approximately 200 feet away now, its massive form becoming a shadow at the edge of his floodlight range. It was circling something, and as Ethan adjusted his position to follow, he saw what had caught its attention. Scattered across the seafloor, partially buried in sediment, were metallic structures. Not natural formations, not geological anomalies, man-made objects. Cylindrical sensors, each about 4 feet long, arranged in a grid pattern that extended beyond his visual range. The creature swam over them, around them, as if it knew they were there, as if it was accustomed to their presence. Ethan began his ascent at 2:49 in the afternoon, following the strict 4-hour decompression schedule required for a dive of that depth and duration. He spent those 4 hours reviewing the footage on his internal monitors, cataloging every detail, and trying to process what he'd witnessed. At 3,000 feet, pressure was 92 atmospheres. At 2,000 feet, it dropped to 61. At 1,000 feet, 31 atmospheres. The submersible rose slowly, methodically, pausing at predetermined depths to allow his body to adjust to the changing pressure. During those pauses, Ethan continued to transmit data to the Nautilus. Temperature readings, sonar logs, water samples he'd collected near the encounter site. Samples that showed unusual chemical signatures he couldn't immediately identify. Reed stayed on the comm the entire time, his voice a constant presence, asking questions Ethan didn't have answers for. Did you see how fast it moved? Did you measure the dorsal fin height? Could you estimate the bite force? Dr. Zhao came on the line twice, her tone clinical and controlled, asking him to confirm specific details. The length estimate, the coloration, the condition of the teeth. At 6:43 that evening, when Ethan finally surfaced and the Nautilus crew unsealed the submersible's hatch, the first thing he saw was not Dr. Zhao or Reed or any of the research team he'd been working with for the past 3 months. The first thing he saw was 3 Coast Guard vessels surrounding the Nautilus, their spotlights turning the darkening ocean surface into a stage of harsh white light. Men in uniform were already on the deck of the research vessel, and standing at the front of the group, wearing a Coast Guard officer's jacket with commander's insignia, was a man Ethan had never seen before. Commander Gerald Vance was tall, gray-haired, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades at sea. Behind him stood another figure, younger, wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself with military precision. This second man had a laptop case slung over his shoulder and an identification badge clipped to his belt that Ethan couldn't quite read from this distance. "Mr. Cole," Commander Vance said, and his voice carried across the deck with absolute authority. "We need to talk about what you found down there, and we need to talk about it right now." Commander Vance didn't waste time with pleasantries. Within 20 minutes of Ethan stepping onto the Nautilus deck, Coast Guard personnel had confiscated every data storage device on the research vessel. The submersible's primary hard drives, backup drives, Dr. Zhao's laptops, Reed's tablets, even the personal phones of the research team. They were methodical, professional, working from a checklist that suggested they'd done this before. The civilian with Vance introduced himself as Dr. Andrew Caldwell, marine biology consultant, though he never specified who he was consulting for. Caldwell was the one who asked most of the questions during the 2-hour debriefing that followed. What was the exact depth of the encounter? What was the creature's estimated length? Did Ethan observe any other biological activity in the area? And most importantly, did he collect any physical samples? Ethan answered truthfully. He'd collected water samples, sediment samples, nothing biological. The creature had been too far away, moving too fast. What he didn't mention was the backup drive, a small solid-state unit no bigger than his thumb, that he kept hidden in a waterproof pouch sewn into the lining of his dive bag. It was a personal protocol he'd developed years ago during his Navy days, when equipment failures and data loss could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Always keep a copy. Always have redundancy. The Coast Guard never searched his personal gear. The official explanation came 3 hours later, delivered by Vance with the kind of rehearsed confidence that made it clear he didn't believe a word of what he was saying. The sonar readings were likely a school of large tuna or a pod of pilot whales creating a false signature. The visual sighting was understandable given the low visibility and extreme depth, but almost certainly a large shark, possibly a Pacific sleeper shark or a misidentified great white. The temperature spike was attributed to proximity to an unknown thermal vent. The metallic objects Ethan had observed were likely debris from a cargo ship that had gone down in the area years ago. Dr. Zhao tried to object, citing the recorded footage, the multiple camera angles, the detailed measurements, but Caldwell cut her off with a smile that never reached his eyes. "The footage will be analyzed by our specialists," he said. "You'll receive a full report in 6 to 8 weeks. Until then, This incident falls under maritime safety protocols. No public statements, no media contact, no discussion of operational details outside this room. By the time Ethan reached his apartment in Long Beach at 11:30 that night, the Pacific Oceanic Research Institute had already sent him an email. They were suspending his contract pending review of safety procedures. He had 72 hours to return all Institute property. Dr. Zhao wasn't answering her phone. Reed sent a single text message that read, "They're transferring me to the Atlantic Survey Team. Leaving tomorrow. Sorry, man." Ethan spent the next 3 days locked in his apartment, analyzing the backup footage frame by frame on his personal computer. What he found made everything worse. The creature's teeth weren't just large. They showed active wear patterns consistent with recent feeding. The serrations along the edges had microfractures that hadn't been smoothed by time or mineralization. These were living teeth, growing teeth, teeth that belonged to an animal that had been hunting and feeding continuously, not teeth that had spent millions of years turning into stone. And the metallic structures on the seafloor, the ones Caldwell had dismissed as shipwreck debris, were too uniform, too deliberately placed. Ethan enhanced the footage, adjusted the contrast, and counted 14 separate cylindrical objects arranged in a grid pattern that extended at least 400 feet in every direction. They looked like sonar buoys or acoustic sensors, the kind used for underwater monitoring. But who had placed them there, at 3,000 feet, in the middle of nowhere? And why had the creature seemed so comfortable swimming among them, as if it had been doing so for years? The internet gave him some answers, but they only raised more questions. Ethan started with simple searches, looking for any reported sightings of unusually large sharks in deep water off the California coast. What he found was a pattern that nobody seemed to be talking about publicly, but that existed in fragments across maritime databases, fishing reports, and archived news articles that had been quietly removed from major news sites but survived in cached versions. In 2011, a deep-sea research team from the University of California had reported a sonar anomaly at 3,200 feet, approximately 200 miles west of San Francisco. The report described an object 60 feet in length moving at high speed. The researchers had requested funding for a follow-up expedition. Funding was denied, and the lead researcher, Dr. Patricia Hennings, had retired 6 months later. In 2015, a Japanese oceanographic ROV had captured 14 seconds of footage at 3,500 feet in the Pacific Trench system east of Japan. The footage showed what the operators described as a shark of unprecedented size. The feed had cut to static, and the ROV had been recovered with extensive damage to its cameras and external sensors. Official explanation: equipment malfunction due to pressure. The footage was never released, but Ethan found a reference to it in a marine biology forum where someone had posted a frame-by-frame analysis before the thread was deleted. In 2018, a commercial fishing trawler operating 140 miles off the Oregon coast had radioed a distress call claiming they'd observed a shark the size of a bus at approximately 1,100 meters while retrieving deep-water nets. The Coast Guard had responded, detained the vessel for 12 hours, interviewed the crew separately, and confiscated all electronic equipment and communications logs. When the trawler's captain tried to file an official report, he was informed that no such incident had occurred, and continued claims would result in suspension of his commercial fishing license. The captain stopped talking, but his first mate had posted about the incident on a maritime workers' forum, and although the original post was gone, people had quoted portions of it in replies. It came up from below the nets, moved past us at a depth that should have been impossible for any living thing that size. We all saw it. 7 crew members, All saw the same thing. They made us sign papers saying we didn't. Ethan found 6 separate incidents between 2011 and 2024. All in the Pacific. All at depths between 3,000 and 3,500 feet. All describing the same impossible thing. And all of them had been quietly suppressed, explained away, or scrubbed from official records. He needed to talk to someone who would understand what this meant, someone with access to information that wasn't available to the public. Marcus Chen had been Ethan's dive supervisor during his last 3 years in the Navy, a master chief with 26 years of service before he'd retired and taken a position with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They'd kept in touch, met for coffee every few months when Marcus was in Long Beach for meetings. Marcus knew how the system worked, knew where bodies were buried, knew which questions would get answered, and which ones would get you labeled a conspiracy theorist. When Ethan called him on the 4th day after the encounter, Marcus answered on the 2nd ring, but didn't say hello. He said, "I was wondering when you'd contact me." They met at a marina in San Pedro, standing on a dock with a view of the container ships moving through the harbor, far enough from any buildings that their conversation couldn't be easily overheard. Marcus looked older than Ethan remembered, more tired, with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too many secrets for too long. Marcus didn't answer Ethan's questions directly at first. Instead, he asked questions of his own. How deep was the encounter? What were the exact coordinates? Did Ethan observe any artificial structures on the seafloor? When Ethan described the cylindrical sensor arrays, Marcus closed his eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly, like a man who'd been dreading this conversation for years. "The acoustic monitoring network," Marcus said quietly, "officially exists to track whale migrations and study marine mammal communication patterns. That's what we tell the public. And it's not entirely a lie. We do monitor whales, but that's not the primary purpose." The network was installed in 2009, funded through a joint program between NOAA, the Navy, and DARPA. The sensors you saw are part of a grid that spans the entire Pacific Rim, concentrated along deep thermal vent systems where the ocean floor drops below 2,000 feet. We call it the Deep Pacific Bioacoustic Array. And we're not listening for whales. We're listening for things that aren't supposed to exist anymore. Ethan wanted to interrupt, wanted to demand clearer answers, but something in Marcus's expression told him to stay quiet and let the story unfold. Marcus continued, his voice barely audible over the sound of waves lapping against the dock pilings. "The official position, the one I'm supposed to give you, is that all reports of unusually large deep-sea predators are misidentifications or hoaxes. That's what we put in the public records. That's what we tell researchers who ask uncomfortable questions. But the truth is, we've known about them since the late 1980s. We've been tracking them, studying them, monitoring their movements for over 30 years. And the reason we don't tell anyone is because the alternative would be chaos." 3 days after his meeting with Marcus, Ethan received an encrypted email from an address he didn't recognize. The message was brief, contained no identifying information, and instructed him to use a specific secure communication application if he wanted to learn more. Ethan, who'd spent enough time in military intelligence circles to recognize a carefully planned contact when he saw one, downloaded the application and followed the instructions. The man on the other end of the video call introduced himself as Dr. Leonard Yates, 70 years old, retired from the Smithsonian Institution's Department of Paleobiology, and former junior researcher on a classified Navy expedition to the Mariana Trench in 1987. Dr. Yates looked like someone who'd been carrying a heavy secret for far too long, his face lined with the kind of weariness that came from knowing something the rest of the world didn't and having no way to share it. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision, as if he'd rehearsed this conversation many times in his head, but never expected to actually have it. In 1987, Yates began, I was 29 years old, fresh out of graduate school, and incredibly fortunate to be selected for a deep-sea research expedition funded by the Office of Naval Research. The official purpose was to study extremophile bacteria near hydrothermal vents. The actual purpose, which I didn't learn until we were 3 weeks into the mission, was to investigate sonar anomalies that Navy submarines had been reporting since the early 1980s. Large, fast-moving objects in deep water. Objects that exhibited predatory behavior patterns. Objects that shouldn't exist. The expedition had descended to 7,000 feet in the Mariana Trench, using a deep submergence vehicle similar to the one Ethan had been piloting. At that depth, they'd encountered what Yates described as a massive apex predator, morphologically consistent with Autodus Megalodon, the species science declared extinct 3.5 million years ago. The creature they'd observed was approximately 65 feet long, possessed the distinctive body structure and dentition of a megalodon, and was actively hunting in waters that theoretically couldn't support such a large predator. The expedition had captured 40 minutes of high-definition footage, collected water samples showing elevated levels of biological activity, and documented behavioral patterns that suggested not a single creature, but a breeding population. When they'd returned to the surface and reported their findings, they'd been met not with scientific excitement, but with military secrecy. The footage was classified. The researchers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements with penalties that included prison time for violations. The official expedition report, the one that entered the public scientific record, made no mention of the encounter. It discussed bacterial samples, thermal vent chemistry, and geological formations. Nothing more. They didn't classify the discovery to hide it from the public, Yates explained, his voice heavy with the weight of decades of silence. They classified it to prevent international incidents. Think about what would happen if we'd announced the existence of living megalodons in international waters. Every nation with deep-sea capabilities would have rushed to claim territory, to capture specimens, to exploit a discovery that would be worth billions in scientific and commercial value. Fishing fleets would have descended on the deep trenches, trying to catch something they didn't understand and couldn't control. Tourism companies would have started offering deep-sea excursions to see real-life sea monsters. The ecological disruption alone would have been catastrophic. And beyond that, confirming that megalodons survived meant confirming that our understanding of extinction was fundamentally flawed. If megalodons survived in the deep ocean, what else survived? What other supposedly extinct species were living in places we'd never properly explored? The implications were too destabilizing, politically and scientifically. Dr. Yates told Ethan something else that changed everything. The sensor array network Marcus had mentioned wasn't just monitoring random deep-sea activity. It was specifically tracking a population estimated at between 40 and 60 individual megalodons distributed along Pacific Rim thermal vent systems from Japan to Chile. The creatures followed predictable migration routes, moving between feeding grounds and what researchers believed were breeding sites in the deepest parts of the ocean trenches. Ethan's encounter hadn't been random chance. The megalodon he'd filmed had been following a known migration corridor that brought it within range of the California coast every 3 to 4 months. The reason Coast Guard vessels had arrived so quickly wasn't because they'd been alerted by Ethan's radio transmission. It was because the sensor array had detected the creature's movement toward shallower water, and protocol required immediate response when megalodons deviated from expected depth ranges. The footage was confiscated not to hide the creature's existence from Ethan, but to prevent it from reaching the public. Because while a megalodon at 7,000 feet was a scientific curiosity that posed no threat to humans, a megalodon hunting at 3,000 feet, at depths accessible to commercial and research vessels, was a different problem entirely. 2 days after his conversation with Dr. Yates, Ethan had another visitor. The man who knocked on his apartment door at 8 in the evening introduced himself as Agent Trevor Rourke, though he didn't specify which agency he represented. Rourke was in his early 40s, dressed in casual civilian clothes, and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who was used to difficult conversations and knew exactly how they would end. He didn't threaten Ethan. He didn't confiscate anything. He simply presented two options with the clarity of someone laying out a business proposal. Option 1, Rourke said, sitting at Ethan's kitchen table without being invited, is that you continue as you have been. You keep the backup footage, you keep asking questions, you keep digging into records that are going to lead you nowhere because the people who control those records are very good at making information disappear. Eventually, you'll post something online or talk to the wrong person, and we'll have to take official action. Your submersible pilot certifications will be suspended pending investigation into safety violations during your last dive. The investigation will take years. Your reputation in the industry will be destroyed. The footage you're hiding will be confiscated through legal channels that you won't be able to fight. You'll spend the next decade of your life in litigation, and you'll lose. That's option 1. Rourke paused, pulled out a tablet from his bag, and placed it on the table between them. Option 2 is that you accept a consulting position with the Deep Pacific Conservation Program, a joint civilian-military initiative that officially doesn't exist, but has been operating since 1993. The position pays $135,000 annually, includes full benefits, and gives you access to information that fewer than 200 people in the world are cleared to see. You'll work with a team of submersible pilots and marine biologists who have all had encounters similar to yours. You'll help us monitor the population, track migration patterns, and ensure that deep-sea industrial operations don't interfere with their habitat. And you'll understand why we've kept this quiet for 30 years. Rourke tapped the tablet screen, and it lit up with a live feed from what appeared to be an underwater camera. The image showed a thermal vent system glowing in the darkness, and moving through the frame, clear as anything Ethan had ever seen, were 3 massive shapes. 3 megalodons swimming in formation through water that registered at 2,800 feet deep. "We need pilots who've seen them and didn't panic," Rourke said. "We need people who understand that what they witnessed isn't a threat that needs to be eliminated. It's a species that needs to be protected. You're one of the few people qualified for this work, Ethan, and frankly, we'd rather have you inside the program than outside it." Ethan signed the non-disclosure agreement 2 days later, this one legitimate and far more detailed than the coercive document the Coast Guard had tried to force on him. The Deep Pacific Conservation Program operated out of a facility in San Diego that looked like any other marine research center from the outside, but contained technology and resources that rivaled anything Ethan had seen during his Navy years. His team consisted of 15 submersible pilots, 11 marine biologists, and 6 data analysts, all of whom had encountered megalodons during deep-sea operations and been recruited the same way Ethan had. Some had seen the creatures while working on oil rig installations. Others had been conducting geological surveys or laying undersea cables. One pilot, a woman named Kelsey from Alaska, had been filming a documentary about thermal vents when a megalodon passed within 50 feet of her submersible, close enough that she could see the individual dermal denticles on its skin and the way its eyes tracked her movement through the viewport. She'd been working for the program for 6 years. During Ethan's first week, he learned the full scope of what they were monitoring. The Megalodon population wasn't endangered, it was thriving. The 40 to 60 individuals initially estimated in the late 80s had grown to somewhere between 90 and 120 based on the most recent acoustic tracking data. The creatures primarily fed on the carcasses of whales and large fish that sank to abyssal zones after dying near the surface, a food source that was both abundant and renewable. They rarely hunted live prey in the way Ethan had witnessed, which made his encounter unusual and significant. The hunting behavior suggested the creatures were adapting, possibly becoming more active in shallower waters, where live prey was more accessible. The sensor array network that Marcus had described was even more extensive than Ethan had imagined. Over 4,000 individual monitoring stations stretched across the Pacific Ocean, creating a three-dimensional map of megalodon movements that updated in real time. The data showed migration patterns that followed seasonal whale movements, breeding aggregations that occurred in the deepest parts of the Mariana and Tonga trenches, and territorial behaviors that suggested the creatures had established feeding grounds that they returned to year after year. The program's primary mission wasn't to hide the megalodons from the public, though that was certainly part of it. The real goal was ensuring that human activity in the deep ocean didn't disrupt their habitat or trigger defensive behaviors that could lead to dangerous encounters. Deep-sea mining operations were quietly redirected away from known megalodon territories. Undersea cable routes were planned to avoid migration corridors. Research expeditions were given classified briefings about depth restrictions and areas to avoid. It was conservation work happening in absolute secrecy, protecting a species that the world believed was extinct. Ethan also discovered he wasn't the only person who'd tried to go public with what they'd seen. Over the past 30 years, 23 individuals had encountered megalodons and attempted to share evidence through media channels, scientific publications, or online platforms. All of them had been approached with the same offer Ethan had received. Most had accepted. The few who refused found their evidence systematically discredited, their professional reputations destroyed through carefully orchestrated campaigns that made them appear unreliable or delusional. It wasn't malicious, it was strategic. Because the alternative, letting proof of living megalodons reach mainstream consciousness, would create exactly the kind of chaos Dr. Yates had warned about. In November of 2024, 7 months after Ethan joined the program, the waters off the California coast where he'd had his encounter were officially designated as the Catalina Deep Marine Sanctuary, a protected area where commercial fishing, deep-sea mining, and unauthorized research activities were permanently prohibited. The official justification cited the region's importance as critical habitat for migrating whale populations and unique deep-sea ecosystems surrounding thermal vent systems. Environmental groups praised the decision. The fishing industry complained, but ultimately complied. Nobody questioned why a sanctuary needed to extend to depths of 4,000 feet, far beyond where whales typically dove. Nobody asked why the Coast Guard maintained a permanent monitoring presence in the area. And nobody connected the sanctuary designation to the fact that acoustic data showed the region as a primary hunting ground for at least 8 individual megalodons who passed through the area every 3 to 4 months following the gray whale migration route. The protection wasn't for the whales. It was for the predators. But in March of 2025, 1 year after his initial encounter, Ethan piloted a submersible back to the same coordinates where he'd first seen the impossible. This time, he wasn't alone. 3 other pilots descended in separate vehicles, all equipped with the program's advanced monitoring equipment and cameras that could capture footage in conditions where normal systems would fail. What they documented during that dive changed everything, The program thought it understood about Megalodon behavior. At 3,100 feet, Ethan's cameras captured two Megalodons swimming together in synchronized patterns that suggested either cooperative hunting or something more complex. The two creatures were different sizes, one approximately 60 feet long, the other closer to 55 feet, and their movements around each other showed a level of coordination that went beyond simple predatory behavior. They circled a thermal vent structure, not to hunt, but seemingly to investigate it, their bodies moving in precise mirror formations that marine biologists would later describe as possible courtship behavior. If the creatures were breeding, if they were reproducing in these waters, then the population wasn't just surviving in isolation, it was growing, it was adapting, and the implications of that were still being debated within the program. But there was something else in that footage, something that kept Ethan awake at night even now. Thermal imaging of the vent systems showed temperature anomalies that had been increasing steadily over the past decade. The water surrounding the vents was warming at a rate of approximately 2 degrees Fahrenheit per year, a change driven by increased volcanic activity deep beneath the seafloor. As the thermal zones expanded and warmed, they were creating corridors of habitable water at progressively shallower depths. The megalodons, adapted to hunt in water temperatures between 38 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, were following those warming corridors upward. The encounter Ethan had witnessed at 3,000 feet? 10 years ago, that same creature would have stayed at 4,000 feet, or deeper. But the water at 3,000 feet was now warm enough, comfortable enough, that the megalodon could hunt there without difficulty. And if the warming continued at its current rate, within another decade, these creatures might be hunting regularly at 2,000 feet, at 1,500 feet, at depths where commercial submarines operated, where scientific research was conducted, where deep-sea tourism ventures brought wealthy thrill-seekers to witness the mysteries of the ocean. The Navy's official position, the one Ethan had been briefed on repeatedly, was that the situation was being monitored and was under control. The megalodons showed no aggression toward submersibles or human activity. They avoided vessels, demonstrated intelligence in their movements, and had never attacked anything except prey animals. The risk to human life was negligible. The program's protocols were sufficient. But Dr. Yates, who Ethan still spoke with occasionally through encrypted channels, had sent an email 3 days ago that consisted of a single sentence. "They're adapting faster than we expected. Much faster." Nobody from the program had responded to that email. Nobody had explained what Dr. Yates meant or what data he was referencing. And when Ethan asked his supervisor about it during their weekly briefing, he was told that Dr. Yates was retired, no longer had access to current monitoring data, and was likely making assumptions based on incomplete information. But Ethan had seen the thermal imaging. He'd watched the footage of those two megalodons moving through water that should have been too warm for them, behaving in ways that suggested not just survival, but thriving adaptation. He'd read the reports showing the population growth from 40 individuals to over 100 in less than 4 decades. And he'd heard the stories from other pilots about encounters at depths shallower than anything previously recorded, about creatures that seemed curious rather than frightened when they encountered human technology, about behavioral changes that nobody could fully explain. The program said everything was under control. The data said the warming would continue. And somewhere in the dark waters off the California coast, in the places where light never reached and pressure could crush steel, something that had survived for millions of years was learning to live in a changing ocean. Whether humans were ready for that change was a question nobody seemed willing to answer.